The gloomy setting of the Mississippi River region. The setting takes us back to a small and quiet town nestled along the murky Mississippi River, a place seemingly forgotten by time. It is the early 2010s, and the region is a snapshot of quintessential Southern Americana: steamboats humming along the mighty river, moss-draped cypress trees towering over dark waters, and weathered wooden docks that tell the tales of generations past. But underlying this tranquil facade, a chilling shadow begins to spread. The Mississippi River, known for its role in shaping the history and culture of America, starts whispering secrets of an ominous kind. A sense of dread washes over the townsfolk, rippling across the tight-knit community. It starts with whispered rumors of him, a figure locals ominously refer to as the Mississippi Wraith. No one knows who or what he is. But the stories spread quickly, like wildfire, and soon, the whole town is gripped with unease. The Wraith, according to hushed conversations passed around smoky barrooms and church pews after Sunday service, is not just a man. He is a ghostly figure who roams the marshy riverbanks at the darkest hours of the night. Sightings are rare, but those who claim to have seen him describe a shadowy silhouette gliding in a small dinghy, the soft splash of his paddle echoing across the still water. The legends surrounding the Mississippi Wraith grow stranger. Some say his haunting figure first appeared decades ago, tied to unsolved murders or mysterious disappearances in the region. Others spin more supernatural theories, claiming he is the ghost of a Civil War deserter, cursed to roam the river for eternity. Some skeptics dismiss the stories as old wives' tales, drunken ramblings, or superstitious folklore. But when bodies begin to surface, mangled, drowned, left in ways no accident could explain, the lines between legend and reality begin to blur. Shackled by financial hardships, the town is already limping through the aftershocks of the 2008 economic crisis. Jobs have dried up as the local shipyards shut down, and despair clings to the air. The bustling vitality that once defined the town seems to slip away with the mist that rolls in off the river each morning, and now, with a growing body count, the once thriving port town descends deeper into darkness. The first victim, an unassuming fisherman named Randall Holtman, was discovered washed ashore near an old ferry dock. At first, law enforcement chalked it up to a drunken mishap, a tragic accident in the unpredictable currents of the mighty Mississippi. But as investigators delved deeper and forensic reports surfaced, it became clear, this was no accident. Holtman's body bore marks of bound wrists and deep abrasions, ones that spoke of a struggle. Not long after, just as the community was hoping to settle back into normalcy, the second body floated into view under the light of the crescent moon. A local schoolteacher, Sarah Mae Jennings, was found not far from the same ferry dock. Her hands were tied tightly with heavy rope, and her face, hauntingly calm in death, bore the macabre remnants of cuts that seemed to mock the idea of innocence. Stuck to her clothing was a withered piece of paper with the chilling words scrawled in ink, "The river never forgets." As the days turned into weeks, a fog of fear and paranoia took root in the town. Parents no longer let their children play outside past dusk, shopkeepers closed early, and even the bravest fishermen began venturing out in pairs if at all. Stranger yet, residents swore they saw peculiar things when peering out into the watery abyss at night. Flickering lantern lights danced like ghosts on the horizon. Occasionally, there was the unmistakable echo of a paddle hitting water, followed by eerie silence. In private conversations, the elderly reminisced about tales their parents used to tell them, stories of unsolved river murders that stretched back decades. Old-timers nodded gravely at mentions of bad omens. They'd mutter cryptically about the river having a memory of its own, and how the Mississippi had always claimed its due from those who dared to cross it. For newcomers to the area, these cryptic soundbites only added to the growing unease. And then came the warnings. Scratched on the weathered boards of river docks or etched into the soft earth near boat landings, grim phrases began to appear. "Time runs out, breathe if you can't hide forever." These macabre messages were always found near where a body would later surface, as if the killer, or whatever this entity was, toyed with the town, knowing they could never stop him. The Mississippi River transformed overnight from a beloved, life-giving artery to a looming, choking presence. It became more than just a backdrop. It became a living, breathing antagonist, capable of swallowing secrets and shrouding horrors in its murky depths. As whispers of a serial killer began to circulate and the story reached the outer edges of the state, it became clear that the authorities had a monster, or perhaps something far worse, hiding in plain sight beneath the calm, unassuming surface of the Mississippi. A chilling first case. The first murder that sent shockwaves through the small Mississippi River town was that of Jason Riggs, a well-known ferry operator who had spent decades navigating the river's unforgiving currents. Riggs was the epitome of a local everyman, gruff, hard-working, and respected for his knowledge of the river. To everyone in town, Jason was as much a part of the Mississippi as the barges that glided down its waters, or the wide cypress trees looming over the swampy banks. That's what made his fate all the more horrifying. It began with his sudden and unexplained disappearance. Jason was last seen one chilly autumn evening, around his usual haunts near the old ferry dock. A few locals swore they saw him dragging his battered cooler to his small motorboat, readying for the nightly run of supplies out to houses on the far side of the river. It wasn't unusual for Jason to work late, and nobody thought much of it. The next morning, however, was a different story. At dawn, as the swamp stirred awake with the slow hum of cicadas and the curling mist began retreating into the tree line, a local shrimp fisherman stumbled upon a scene that would shake the town to its core. There, tangled in the reeds and floating lifelessly along a quiet tributary, was Jason's body. His skin was pale and sodden, giving him the appearance of a watery specter. His hands were bound tightly with thick fishing line, and his torso showed deep bruising, a pattern that suggested he had been held down, beaten or perhaps restrained against his will. The expression frozen on his face was what chilled the sheriff's deputies to their bones, a twisted, wide-eyed grimace that hinted at the terror he must have endured in his final moments. Sheriff Tom Harwood was one of the first responders to the scene. A burly man who had spent most of his life in the area, he wasn't easily shaken. But when he saw the thin, narrow gashes running down Riggs's arms and the weighted chain still clinging to his legs like a grim anchor, the sheriff knew this wasn't going to be an easy case to close. "This ain't no accident," Harwood muttered under his breath to his deputy, a young recruit named Levi Walker who had just moved to the town. "This is personal, and whoever did this, they wanted us to know." Word spread quickly through the town, as it always does in small communities. Jason Riggs wasn't just a ferry operator, he was a thread woven into the fabric of their lives. Practically everyone either worked with him at some point or relied on his services. The idea that someone could do this to him, it made people uneasy in a way they hadn't felt in years. In coffee shops, on back porches, at church meetings, and inside the smoky walls of the local dive bar, the same question was murmured over and over: who would want Jason dead? The initial investigation turned up very little. Jason's wallet was untouched, still tucked into the front pocket of his waterlogged jeans. There were no witnesses who had seen or heard anything unusual on the night he supposedly disappeared. His motorboat was found upriver in what looked like an intentional grounding. Its gas tank was nearly empty, and one of the oars was splintered, but there were no obvious clues left behind. Harwood's team speculated that the killer might have been familiar with the river and its many hidden channels. Whoever did this knew exactly where to put the body so it wouldn't drift too far, but enough to make damn sure it'd be found, Harwood told a local reporter, who was already sniffing around for headlines. Then, there was the odd symbol. Carved faintly into the underside of Jason's boat near the stern was what appeared to be a crudely etched crescent moon, with lines extending from it like sun rays. Some dismissed it as random graffiti or the scrawl of bored teenagers, but Sheriff Harwood wasn't convinced. "This means something," he told his team during a late-night meeting at the station. "People don't leave marks like this unless they're trying to send a message." Adding to the intrigue was a chilling detail uncovered during the autopsy. The coroners determined Jason Riggs had most likely drowned after a severe beating left him incapacitated. What was strange, however, was the presence of fibers embedded beneath his fingernails. They appeared to come from a coarse, burlap-like material, similar to an old sack, or the type of rope once used on fishing trawlers decades ago. "It doesn't fit," muttered Harwood, poring over the autopsy report in his cluttered office. "Why the hell would Jason be fighting with a sack? Unless—" Rumors began stirring in the community, as they often do in such tightly knit towns. Some claimed to have seen a strange boat drifting downriver the night Jason went missing. "Small boat," described Earl Thompson, an old-timer who lived down on the bend by the bayou. "Didn't look like no regular fishing boat. There was something off about it. Didn't hear no engine, just the sound of a paddle hitting the water, soft-like. Gave me the creeps." Earl's tail was brushed off at first, seen as nothing more than the ramblings of a whiskey-addled mind, but as the days went by, others began recounting similar encounters. Shadows slipping silently across the river, strange lights glowing faintly in the swamp, the muffled splash of movement where no one dared venture at night. Yet, it wasn't just superstition that bothered the investigators. As Harwood and his team dug deeper into Jason Riggs' personal life, they found fragments of a past tangled up in debt and whispered feuds. Unsubstantiated claims arose about money borrowed from questionable sources, a shadowy world of unlicensed loans and coerced payoffs that thrived in the back alleys of small-town America. Some thought Jason had owed money to the wrong people, and they'd come to collect in the most brutal way possible. Others raised darker suspicions, connecting his death to a name that had popped up in whispered bar conversations for years: the Wraith. The emergence of a string of murders. What began as one tragic death near the Mississippi River quickly turned into something no one in the town could have imagined, a pattern of horror that would leave the community forever scarred. Within weeks of Jason Riggs's murder, the small riverside town found itself grappling with the horrifying realization that his death was not an isolated incident. Someone or something was leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. The second victim, Mary Collins, was discovered less than a month after Jason's death. Mary was a middle-aged schoolteacher, loved and respected by all who knew her. She was the kind of woman who always brought baked goods to church picnics and spent summer afternoons grading papers on her front porch. Her brutal murder sent shockwaves through the community. Her body was found crumpled by the riverbank near an abandoned dock, a place where fishermen used to gather before the area fell into disrepair. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back with a coarse rope, almost identical to the one used in Jason Riggs's murder. Her blouse was stained with dirt, blood, and an inexplicable sticky residue. Across the front of her blouse, scrawled in what appeared to be chemical ink, were the chilling words, "You can't run forever." The discovery shook the town to its core. People whispered nervously to one another in hushed tones, speculating on what could have driven someone to commit such an act of violence against a kind, beloved teacher. Theories spiraled, from religious fanatics to escaped criminals creeping in through the shadows of the river. Yet, deep in their hearts, most knew these murders had a deeper, far more sinister connection. Sheriff Tom Harwood found himself battling not only the horrifying crime scenes but also the community's growing fear. The once friendly vibe of the town had shifted into something darker. Parents kept their children locked inside when the sun began to set, shops closed early, and the streets emptied out by twilight. Rumors spread faster than Harwood could control. Some swore they saw shadowy figures watching them from across the river. Others claimed to hear faint echoes of laughter coming from the direction of the abandoned docks late at night. Compounding the horror was a bizarre detail at each crime scene, cryptic warnings etched into surfaces or left behind on the victims. On Mary's blouse were the words, "You can't run forever," but Jason's boat had that strange crescent moon symbol scratched into the wood, something that had befuddled investigators. Then, a new message appeared at the scene of the third murder, escalating the case to a terrifying crescendo. The third victim was Matthew Carter, a middle-aged mechanic and occasional boat repairman who made his living fixing the battered fishing boats that most residents relied on. His body was pulled from a shallow part of the river, lodged against driftwood not far from where Mary had been found. This time, the killer left something startling: an old, bloodied burlap sack tied to his wrists. A sack full of rusted tools and heavy rocks designed to weigh him down. Buried under his fingernails were chips of bright blue paint, the kind used on the old boats that once lined the riverside docks. The significance of the paint was unclear, but the message was not: the river takes its own. Sheriff Harwood and his team felt the walls closing in. "This ain't random," Harwood told Levi Walker, his young deputy, over late-night cups of stale coffee in the sheriff's office. "We're not looking at accidents or some angry drunk out for revenge. Whoever's doing this, it's planned. Hell, it's a damn performance." The killer's methods hinted at someone who thrived on control and precision. Each victim had some connection to the river. Jason Riggs piloted a ferryboat, Mary Collins was known to take quiet evening walks near the water, and Matthew Carter had worked on countless boats. But beyond their ties to the Mississippi, there seemed to be no clear links. Different ages, different livelihoods, and no obvious enemies in common. What tethered these crimes together was the river itself, and something or someone lurking in its shadowed depths. As bodies began to pile up, the fear in the town evolved. People stopped venturing near the water. Even Strickland Brothers, the town's most famous fishing business, scaled back their operations after sundown. Casual gossip transformed into desperate speculation. Some believed the killer was a local who knew the Mississippi's maze-like current system better than anyone else, able to navigate its hidden inlets and obscure tributaries under the cover of fog and moonlight. Others spun wild tales of a ghostly wraith who sought vengeance on anyone who disrespected the river's natural order. To add to the chaos, peculiar sightings began pouring in from all corners of the riverfront. Lantern lights flickering on the water near the old docks. Silent boats gliding past at hours when no one should have been awake. Missed footsteps heard on muddy trails that vanished into thin air. Earl Thompson, the elderly man who'd first claimed to see the mysterious boat near Jason Riggs's disappearance, now had company. His unsettling experience was soon echoed by others. The whispers of this Mississippi wraith began to solidify into something resembling an urban legend. "You hear that paddle splashing out there, you'd best keep your head low," warned Earl in one of his many whiskey-soaked rants. Most laughed it off, but for those who dared gaze out onto the Mississippi at night, a glimmer of unease clawed at the edges of their conscience. Warnings, far more direct than Earl's tales, also began appearing in places they shouldn't. Etchings in the mud near the boat landings, cryptic phrases scratched into wooden posts along the riverbank. "Breathe while you still can, no one escapes the river, he sees you." The messages were macabre, taunting, and deeply personal. By the time the fourth victim surfaced, a young mother named Annabelle Green, found clutching a doll with an anchor etched into its face, the town's fear spiraled into chaos. What horror could warrant such brutality? Sheriff Harwood doubled the night patrols, urging his team, "If we don't catch him soon, it's only gonna get worse. People are leaving this town. Hell, they're leaving their lives behind just to get away from this." He wasn't wrong. Families began vacating riverfront properties, and even longtime residents who'd lived by the Mississippi for generations chose safety over sentimentality. The once thriving heart of the town, the river, had turned into its darkest nightmare. As the list of victims grew, so did the list of questions Sheriff Harwood's team couldn't answer. Was this the work of one man, or was the wraith an invented excuse for something more sinister, something organized? What drove the killer to choose their victims? And, perhaps most hauntingly of all, where would the river's dark embrace strike next? Police and the first steps of the investigation. Sheriff Tom Harwood sat at his cluttered desk, coffee growing cold beside stacks of files and photographs. The town's fear was palpable and it weighed heavily on his shoulders like the humid Mississippi air. The murders weren't just brutal, they were methodical, deliberate, and drenched in symbolism that left the usually tight-lipped sheriff both frustrated and unnerved. Harwood wasn't used to cases like this. He knew how to handle fights at the local bar, break-ins at the bait shop, or even the rogue smuggling operation down by the river. But this? A string of murders with cryptic messages and no clear motive? This was beyond anything the sleepy little town had ever seen. Joined by Levi Walker, his sharp but green deputy, and the small team of sheriff's department staff, Harwood began piecing together the few shreds of evidence. The first step was to connect the dots between the victims. Jason Riggs, the stoic ferry operator, Mary Collins, the beloved teacher, Matthew Carter, the gruff boat mechanic, and now Annabelle Green, a young mother with no apparent ties to the others. The perpetrator didn't just choose victims at random. It wasn't coincidence. "There's something here we're missing," Harwood muttered, running a finger across his jaw as he stared at the map of the river pinned to the wall. "The river ain't just where this guy dumps the bodies, there's something about it. It's part of his whole damn plan." The team had already combed through hours of evidence. Crime scene photos from the riverbanks were spread across the conference table. The bound wrists, the calculated placement of cryptic notes, the eerie presence of items that didn't belong to the victims, like the doll found in Annabelle Green's hands. Levi Walker, seated across from Harwood, pointed toward one of the messages, "The river takes its own," etched into a piece of driftwood near Matthew Carter's body. "What do you think he means by that, Sheriff? Some kind of philosophy?" Harwood sighed heavily. "I think he's telling us he owns the damn river, Walker." Despite the best efforts of forensics, the team was hitting walls. The fibers found beneath Jason Riggs's fingernails, they were traced to burlap sacks, the kind sold in any hardware store across 3 counties. The strange crescent moon symbol carved into Jason's boat? Nobody had seen anything like it before, at least nothing documented, and it only added to the otherworldly aura surrounding the killings. Nevertheless, Harwood was determined to start finding patterns, no matter how vague. The case breaks wide open in the bars and docks. Harwood understood that small-town investigations often relied as much on word of mouth as they did on evidence. He had his crew spread out in the places that mattered: smoky bars where locals talked too freely after a few whiskeys, greasy diners where fishermen shared tall tales, and the dilapidated picket fences of neighbors who always seemed to know more than they let on. "You find out anything unusual happening over the last month, you bring it straight to me. Got it?" he ordered his team one afternoon. What the sheriff didn't expect was the wealth of rumors that began pouring in, each one more unsettling than the last. Locals insisted they'd seen shadowy figures lurking by the docks late at night. One man claimed to hear the soft splash of paddles where there shouldn't have been any boats. An older fisherman, Earl Thompson, swore on his life that he'd seen a strange man silently drifting downriver in a small, ancient-looking canoe, always just beyond the reach of his floodlight. "Wasn't no tourist," Earl grumbled. "This guy, he wasn't fishing, wasn't paddling like he meant to go anywhere. He was just watching us." Harwood couldn't decide if Earl was full of whiskey or genuine fear, but either way it couldn't be ignored. Profiling the killer, Harwood reluctantly brought in an external profiler from the state headquarters, drawing the ire of some of his own deputies who believed outsiders wouldn't understand the dynamics of their insular town. But Harwood needed insight beyond his intuition. The profiler, Special Agent Erica Delaney, spent hours in the field with the sheriff, leading discussions that delved into the psychology of the killer. "This isn't random," Delaney said, pointing to a corkboard cluttered with photos and notes. "Your guy is deliberate, he's organized. Look how he leaves these messages, he's not rushing, he's taking time to craft them. He's setting a stage, Sheriff." Harwood folded his arms, his expression hard. "That means he's confident. Too damn confident because he thinks we're not even close to catching him." Delaney nodded. "He's escalating too. If Annabelle Green's murder doesn't tell you that, nothing will. You don't tie a doll to a victim like that unless you want people to notice. He's enjoying the attention." Delaney also emphasized the river as a symbol. "I think he views the Mississippi as his territory, almost like it belongs to him. Or like it's this ancient force he's got power over. Every move he makes is tied to the water. He doesn't just dump victims here, the river is central to his message." Harwood grunted in agreement. It was an angle he hadn't been able to put into words yet, but it made sense. The killer wasn't just using the river as a dumping ground, it was an extension of his identity. Startling clues begin to emerge. The investigation gained momentum when, during a second sweep of the dock area where Annabelle Green's body was found, Deputy Levi Walker uncovered a half-charred cigarette with traces of a chemical compound the department hadn't encountered before. Lab results later identified it as a pesticide often used on riverboats, a lead that narrowed their suspect pool significantly. "Whoever this guy is, he's got access to fishing boats or those swamp barges," Harwood muttered. "Start checking everyone in town with a damn license." Meanwhile, further questioning of Mary Collins' students revealed a haunting connection. Days before her death, she'd mentioned to her Sunday school class that she'd seen something strange while walking by the river, something she couldn't explain but didn't want to talk about. Maybe it was nothing, one of her students had told the sheriff, but Miss Collins, she kind of seemed scared when she said it. The town spirals into panic. The more the department dug, the more rumors flourished. Everyone in town seemed to know someone who had seen or heard something unusual, yet few concrete leads materialized. The town deteriorated into paranoia. Fishermen stopped venturing out into the water alone. Shops closed earlier every night. Some of the older residents built routines around staying indoors by sundown, harking back to an era of superstition and haunting tales. Sheriff Harwood, despite feeling the mounting pressure, suppressed the panic bubbling beneath his stoic exterior. He knew leadership in times like this meant keeping calm, even when he wasn't. Every night, as he stared at the corkboard riddled with crime scene photos, with the messages the killer left behind staring mockingly at him, Harwood wondered when and where the killer would strike next. "We find him," Harwood whispered to himself late one night, staring out his office window where the river gleamed faintly in the moonlight. "We stop him before he turns this town into his goddamn playground." The investigation uncovers a first suspect. In every investigation, there comes a point where a suspect emerges, the first name that lights up the board and gives investigators something or someone to chase. For Sheriff Tom Harwood and his team, that name was Lucas Grady. It started as a faint whisper on the edges of the investigation, nothing more than a flicker of suspicion. Lucas was a dock worker with a reputation in town that ranged from the indifferent to the openly hostile. A loner by nature, he rarely engaged with others beyond the confines of the shipyard. He kept to himself, but people whispered behind his back. Folks said he had a temper, that he knew how to hold a grudge, and, more alarmingly, that he had connections to less than reputable circles, namely, underground loan sharks that operated quietly but no less ruthlessly in the Mississippi River towns. Lucas had been known to borrow money when times got tough, and when it came to paying, it was rumored he'd rather fight than fold. Sheriff Harwood didn't need rumors, though. He needed facts. The first real break in the case came when Levi Walker, the deputy whose youthful determination often offset his inexperience, stumbled across a connection at the docks. An old tugboat operator, Toby Hanlon, had come forward after overhearing some chatter late one night down by the harbor. "Lucas," Toby began, shifting uncomfortably on his stool as Levi poured him a cup of coffee at the station. "I saw him out on his boat, same night Mary Collins disappeared. He had that old patched-up dinghy of his tied up next to mine. Wouldn't think much of it, but—" Toby trailed off, his knotted hands clutching the coffee mug tightly. "But what?" Levi pushed, leaning in. Toby's eyes darted around as though he were afraid someone would overhear. "He weren't alone that night. Saw him loading something into the boat, something heavy, wrapped up like a tarp or something. Didn't sit right with me." That was all Harwood's team needed to zone in on Lucas. Suspicion shifted into action. Harwood assembled his team in the dimly lit meeting room of the sheriff's office, the yellow light overhead buzzing faintly as they hashed out a plan. "Let's talk about Lucas Grady," Harwood said, pinning Lucas's weathered mugshot to the corkboard already crowded with maps, notes, and crime scene photos. "We know he works the docks. He's got access to boats, knows the river like the back of his hand. And now we've got someone who puts him out there, right near the time Mary Collins went missing." "Not just access to boats," interrupted Walker. "The guy lives on the edge of the river. You know that rundown shack past the old bait shop? What's stopping him from using it as his base of operations?" Harwood nodded, his arms crossed. "Exactly, but here's what stinks to me. This isn't just some guy losing his temper over an argument or a bad debt. These killings, they've all got precision. Messages left behind, bodies dumped strategically in the parts of the river where they'd be found but not too quickly. This killer isn't sloppy. If it's Lucas, we're looking at a lot more than a simple hothead." The nail in Lucas's coffin, at least metaphorically for now, came a day later, when a second tip came in about him, this time not from a fisherman, but from a former dockyard colleague. The man, who asked to remain anonymous, claimed Lucas had admitted late one night over a whiskey-laced conversation that he knew how to make people disappear. "Well, that's convenient timing," Harwood muttered as he read Levi's report. "We'll see how chatty he feels once we put some pressure on him." With enough circumstantial evidence to warrant further action, Harwood secured a search warrant for Lucas Grady's property. It didn't take much effort to locate his small, dilapidated home, a sagging structure on the edge of the marsh, surrounded by knee-high grass and the faint smell of stagnant water. The house was silent as Harwood and his deputies approached, the faint creak of the wooden porch the only sound breaking the humid quiet. Lucas answered the door with the kind of surly attitude Harwood half expected. The man was tall and wiry, his face weathered from years under the southern sun. His clothes were stained with what might have been oil or river mud, and his pale gray eyes darted suspiciously between the deputies. "What the hell's this about, Sheriff?" Lucas barked, gripping the wooden doorframe tightly. "I think you know what this is about," Harwood replied in his measured tone, holding up the warrant. "We've got a few questions, Lucas, and we're going to need a look around your property." For someone claiming innocence, Lucas didn't put up much of a fight, but his thinly veiled frustration didn't go unnoticed. "Y'all think you're real clever, don't you? Dragging folks like me into this mess just 'cause I ain't got no goddamn lawyer?" he spat, stepping aside reluctantly. Inside, the house was as unsettling as its owner. The walls were bare, save for a couple of faded photographs and a calendar stuck on the previous year. The furniture was mismatched, patched together like afterthoughts or hand-me-downs. And the stench, it was a blend of damp wood and something sharper, metallic, that set the deputies on edge. Harwood's eyes scanned the cluttered living room, his gut telling him they were in the right place, even if they hadn't found anything yet. The breakthrough came when Deputy Walker, poking around Lucas's run-down shed by the water, found something buried under old tarps and rusting tools, an oar, splintered and stained with what appeared to be dried blood. Next to it was a coiled length of rope almost identical to the one used to bind Mary Collins. Harwood stood over the discovery, his jaw tightening. "Bag it," he ordered curtly as Walker carefully collected the evidence. "Get it to the lab yesterday." Lucas maintained his innocence during the entire process, his tone shifting from hostile to defensive as the search dragged on. "You ain't gonna find anything, Sheriff," he sneered as they cuffed him for questioning later that evening. "Y'all making a mistake." Despite Lucas's protests, Harwood couldn't shake the feeling that the man was hiding something. The blood on the ore awaited analysis, but the circumstantial evidence sparked tension in the department and the town. Lucas was released temporarily. No hard evidence tied him directly to the murders yet, but he was under close surveillance. "If he so much as crosses the street, Funny, I want a report on my desk," Harwood told Walker, frustrated but determined. Back in the sheriff's office that night, Levi broke the silence in the room. "You know, Sheriff, if this guy is our killer, why's he leaving all these traces? Feels almost like he's toying with us." Harwood leaned back in his chair, his expression dark. "We're either dealing with someone smarter than we're giving him credit for, or Lucas Grady's just a pawn in something a whole lot bigger. One way or the other, we're gonna find out." A new clue from the evidence sheriff. Tom Harwood didn't believe in luck, at least not anymore. Days of dead ends, frustrated deputies, and sleepless nights had taught him that breaks in a case came not from chance, but from persistence or desperation. And yet when the forensic lab called to share a new finding on the Matthew Carter case, that faint flicker of hope stirred in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they were finally onto something. It started as these things often did, with something small enough to be overlooked. Tiny flecks of chipped blue paint embedded under Matthew Carter's fingernails. At first glance it seemed incidental, just another detail easy to dismiss. Many of the old boats that crawled up and down the Mississippi had once been painted in bright colors, faded by decades of sun, water, and neglect. But the forensics team flagged it as unusual. "This isn't just any paint," the lead analyst told Harwood over the phone. "The chemical composition matches marine-grade paint from at least 50 years ago. You don't see much of it anymore except on boats that haven't been touched in decades. Vintage stuff." Harwood frowned, leaning on his cluttered desk as he played the information over in his mind. "And you're saying Carter didn't come into contact with it himself?" he asked, gripping the receiver tighter. "Not likely," the analyst replied. "That particular pigment and resin mix, they were discontinued years before Carter was born. If it's under his fingernails, Sheriff, someone put it there." The revelation added weight to the theory that Matthew Carter's murder wasn't just some opportunistic crime. Whoever killed him knew the river and its secrets, including which forgotten corners housed relics like old, derelict boats. "Thanks, Lisa," Harwood said gruffly before hanging up. He immediately called his team into the conference room. "All right, listen up," Harwood started, standing next to a corkboard plastered with photographs and evidence bags. The blue paint flecks and the fibers found under Carter's nails were tacked to the center of the board. "We've got something here and we're not letting it slip through. The paint under Carter's nails? It's not new. It's old, real old vintage marine-grade stuff. The kind you'd find on boats abandoned so long ago, people forgot they even exist." Levi Walker shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "So, what does that mean? Are we talking about some old fishing vessel or a piece of junk rotting away in the back of some barn?" Harwood shook his head. "Not a barn. A barn won't float down the goddamn river. No, this paint points us back to water. If this killer's been working out of some ancient wreck, it could explain why he's had such an easy time disappearing. No registration, no lights, no noise, just him, the river, and that damn paddle we keep hearing about." It wasn't just the paint that intrigued Harwood. More forensics from Carter's case revealed fragments of soiled, thick fabric still clinging to his clothing. Burlap, to be precise. The kind used in old boat sacks, once popular for hauling fishing gear back in the day. The cloth was soaked with river silt, worn and torn in a way that suggested decades of neglect. It matched the material Lucas Grady had been hoarding in his shed, but there were no fingerprints, no direct connection yet. "Levi," Harwood barked, turning his attention to his youngest deputy. "Take Riley with you and go check out every dockyard and scrapyard along the riverbank. I don't care if it's a private property or it hasn't been touched since the Civil War. I want eyes on every goddamn boat that might fit this paint. And if you find the one we're looking for, you make sure it doesn't get the chance to disappear again." Levi nodded, already writing notes into his small battered notebook. He, like the rest of the team, knew cases like this didn't offer up easy resolutions. But that didn't stop the gnawing doubt from creeping into the back of his thoughts. What if they were wrong? What if the killer wasn't using some old ghost ship to stalk the river, but something even harder to trace? Meanwhile, Harwood's thoughts drifted back to the other cryptic details surrounding the murders. The crescent moon etched into Jason Riggs's boat, the eerie, taunting messages left behind at each crime scene, and now this, the deliberate choice of a boat covered in ancient paint, built for a time long past. The more the sheriff thought about it, the more it felt like the killer was stitching together some morbid tapestry, every thread pulled from the depths of the Mississippi's shadowy past. "This whole thing," Harwood muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "It's like he wants us to chase the damned river. He's got us following ghosts." The team's search turned up results faster than anyone expected. Barely 48 hours later, Levi stormed into the sheriff's office, his face flushed from a mixture of adrenaline and exhaustion. "We found something," he announced, tossing a handful of hastily printed photographs onto Harwood's desk. The images showed a battered old fishing boat half submerged in the marshy shallows. It was covered in grime and moss, its hull splintered in places, but there was no mistaking the streaks of faded blue paint along its side. "Matches the description from forensics," Levi added. "It's hidden near one of the side channels, not far from where Carter's body was dropped." Harwood leaned over the photographs, studying the boat with narrowed eyes. "Anything inside?" he asked. "Not much," Levi admitted. "Just trash, some old ropes that could have been used for the bindings, and what looks like dried mud caked onto the floorboards. No motor, just a set of oars left behind." "Let me guess," Harwood said dryly. "One of the oars is busted." "Exactly," the sheriff exhaled sharply. This was it, a sliver of physical evidence tying the mysterious paint and Carter's murder to a tangible location. But it wasn't satisfaction Harwood felt as he studied the photographs. It was something darker. The killer had left them the boat, almost as if he wanted them to find it. All the evidence that could have been useful, blood samples, fingerprints, or anything truly incriminating, was long gone, scrubbed clean by the river's murky waters. "This son of a bitch," Harwood muttered, throwing the photographs down. "He's playing with us. He wanted us to find this." Levi frowned. "Why would he leave us something, and why now?" Harwood didn't answer immediately. He stood silently, staring out the window at the Mississippi, its calm surface betraying none of the mysteries it held. The truth, he realized, was that whoever they were hunting didn't just see himself as a killer. He was something more, a manipulator who saw the river as his stage and each victim as a part of his performance. Everything, the cryptic symbols, the taunting notes, and now the planted boat, was part of some dark narrative the sheriff was being forced to unravel. "Why now?" Harwood finally repeated, his voice low. "Because he knows exactly where this is going, and he knows we've got no choice but to follow the river's lead." Rising tensions in the community. The Mississippi River had always been a symbol of life for the small riverside town. For generations it provided livelihoods for fishermen, a passage for trade, and a steady rhythm of life that flowed as predictably as the river itself. But now, it had become something entirely different, a source of fear, a looming reminder of the darkness lurking in its depths. The calm surface of the river no longer brought peace. It brought questions, suspicion, and for most, a raw sense of vulnerability. When news of the murders and the growing investigation spread, the town was shaken to its core. At first, people thought Jason Riggs's death was a tragic accident, maybe the result of an unlucky night on the water. Then came Mary Collins, and the illusion of safety cracked. By the time Matthew Carter and Annabelle Green's bodies were found, fear consumed the town. It was no longer a matter of random tragedy, it was deliberate, targeted, and whoever was behind it was still out there. The tight-knit community fractures families began changing the way they lived overnight. Parents no longer let their kids stray far from home, let alone play by the riverbanks, where laughter and the carefree spirit of childhood had once echoed. The old unspoken curfew, when the town naturally wound down after dusk, turned into a hard rule. Windows were locked, porch lights stayed on through the night. Grocery stores and corner shops that had stayed open late for neighbors now closed hours earlier. Even the local bar, which had always been a haven for late-night river stories, saw its business slow as regulars drank quicker and left earlier, their eyes darting to the door every time it creaked open. The town of just over 2,000 people, once a place of friendly nods and neighborly chats, began to turn on itself. Rumors swirled, often whispered behind closed doors or muttered in the pews after church services. "Did you hear about Lucas Grady? They say the sheriff's looking into him. He's always been a strange one." "I heard it's not just one person." What if there's a group working together, something like a cult? What if it's not even human? You know what they say about the river? Strange things happen out there. Neighbor turned against neighbor as people began to wonder who could be trusted. Old grudges and small-town rivalries resurfaced, and for the first time, people started seeing the familiar faces around them in a different light. The smallest quirks, a man who rarely left his house, a woman who always walked her dog alone at night, suddenly became fuel for suspicion. It was as if the killer wasn't just taking lives, he was dismantling the very fabric of the community, the business of fear. Local businesses felt the strain too. The fishermen, who had always been the backbone of the town, began pulling in their lines earlier and heading back to shore long before the sun dipped below the horizon. Some stopped going out altogether, scared of what, or who, they might encounter on the water. Boats that had once brought fresh fish to market now sat idle at the docks, their oars and nets gathering dust. Even Strickland Brothers, the town's most well-known fishing enterprise, cut its hours. One of the Strickland brothers, Walt, voiced what many were thinking as he tied up his boat earlier than usual one crisp October evening. "It ain't safe out there anymore," he told the few dock workers still hanging around. "When you're out on the river, you don't just feel like someone's watching you, you know someone's watching you." The docks, once lively and bustling with the sounds of daily labor, grew eerily quiet as the season wore on. The economy of the town began to shift, with people staying home, hoarding what they could, and avoiding situations that might make them a target. Tourism, the lifeblood of many small Mississippi River towns, dried up almost instantly. Word about the Wraith had spread beyond the town, and nobody wanted to spend their hard-earned vacation time in what was now being described as a haunted, cursed community. The fog of rumors. As fear spread its tendrils through the streets, the stories grew darker, stranger, and harder to control. Children whispered about seeing a shadowy figure paddling across the water in the middle of the night. Couples walking home near the river's edge claimed to hear faint laughter carried on the cold wind, the sound vanishing as quickly as it came. Even the strongest skeptics in town began to second-guess their beliefs, especially as more stories piled up. One story came from Earl Thompson, who lived in a beaten-up house right by a bend in the river. Earl had always been dismissed as the town drunk, a man who preferred whiskey to human company. But Earl swore up and down that he'd seen a lantern flickering out on the water late at night, a light too dim and slow-moving to be from a working boat. "It weren't no damn fisherman," Earl slurred one night at the bar after having one drink too many. "I swear on my life that thing, whatever it was just driftin', no motor, just the paddlin', soft, like it didn't want to be heard." Though most rolled their eyes at Crazy Earl, his account added to the growing sensation that something unnatural was happening. People began talking about the river as if it were alive, almost sentient. Some even blamed the water itself. "The Mississippi's got a memory," one old-timer said cryptically, his leathery face showing no trace of humor. "It don't forget what's owed to it." The media circus. Then came the reporters. News vans rolled into town, their bright lights flashing and microphones shoved into the faces of shopkeepers and grieving families. The media spun the story into something far grander and more grotesque. A river monster, terrorizing innocent people with headlines like, "The Mississippi Wraith Strikes Again," plastered onto screens and newspapers everywhere. For Sheriff Harwood, the attention only made things worse. He was already stretched too thin trying to sift through rumors, decipher cryptic clues, and keep a terrified town from collapsing into full-blown hysteria. Now he had to deal with camera crews tramping through crime scenes and sensational stories that only painted the town as helpless. "This ain't a damn horror movie," Harwood growled one afternoon during an impromptu press conference, his patience visibly thinning. "This is real, and we're doing everything we can to stop it." But his words did little to calm the community. The cameras cut away, the headlines continued to blame both the police and the unknown killer, and even the most steadfast townsfolk began looking for the quickest way out. The exodus. By late fall, the exodus began. Families packed what they could and left in the dead of night, unwilling to stay in a place where every shadow felt threatening and every splash on the river sounded like an omen. Moving trucks became a common sight, rumbling down the crooked old roads that led away from the river. Some left notes for friends and neighbors explaining their decision, others simply disappeared, their homes left empty and quiet. The lifeblood of the town, the proud, determined people who had given it its character and spirit, was draining away. And with every person who left, with every child no longer playing in the yards or fisherman no longer dragging in his catch, the killer's victory felt closer. A town on the brink. Sheriff Harwood felt the weight of it all, watching a community he had spent his entire life protecting teeter on the edge of collapse. As he drove through the streets one evening, he noticed how familiar landmarks now seemed foreign. The little diner he'd gone to for morning coffee had its windows shuttered and its doors locked. The neighborhood grocery store was now closing before the sun even touched the horizon. And the docks, once lively and filled with the sound of hard work, were ghostly silhouettes against the water. "This ain't just about the murders anymore," he said to himself, gripping the wheel tightly. "This town's dying a little more every day." The first dangerous standoff. It was a crisp autumn night in 2010, the kind of night when the air carried just enough of a chill to make the Mississippi River seem all the more ominous. Sheriff Tom Harwood and his team had spent weeks chasing shadows, piecing together the clues left behind by their elusive suspect, Lucas Grady. Every discovery, every lead, had brought them closer to this moment, a high-stakes operation that none of them could afford to botch. The plan was simple but dangerous. They were going to catch Lucas in the act. The bait was set. The abandoned harbor on the town's southern edge, long forgotten by most locals, had become a ghostly stage for Lucas's nighttime activities. Reports of strange boat launches, late-night movements, and eerie lantern lights had centered around this location for the past month. Harwood suspected it was one of Lucas's primary spots, a place where he could lie low, launch his battered old boat, and disappear into the labyrinthine waterways of the Mississippi. The sheriff's gut told him that Lucas wouldn't stray far, not tonight. "All right, listen up," Harwood said, addressing his deputies in the dim light of the patrol station's break room. His voice was calm, yet it carried a weight that made everyone straighten in their chairs. Levi Walker, the youngest on the team, was scribbling notes furiously, while the older deputies sat silently, their faces worn but resolute. "This ain't just another night on the clock," Harwood began, glancing at the map of the harbor tacked to the wall behind him. "We're not dealing with someone who's gonna come quietly. Lucas Grady is unpredictable, he's reckless. But tonight we're gonna corner him. No excuses, no slip-ups." He jabbed his index finger toward the map. "We'll split into 3 teams. Riley and Foster, you'll take the west side near the old warehouse. Levi and I will cover the docks. Jenkins, your team is on the north edge by the woods. He's been seen launching his boat there more than once. Stay low, stay quiet, and wait for my signal. No one moves unless I say so." Levi raised a hand tentatively. "Sheriff, what if he's armed?" Harwood's eyes met Levi's with a steady, unflinching gaze. "Then we handle it. Same way we always do. Calm, controlled, and by the book. But make no mistake, this guy's already proven he's got nothing to lose. Don't expect him to play nice." The meeting wrapped quickly, and within the hour, the team was in position. The harbor was bathed in shadows, the moonlight barely cutting through the thick canopy of trees that loomed over the area. The air was eerily still, save for the occasional creak of old boards or the distant sound of water lapping against the docks. It felt like the entire town was holding its breath. The standoff begins. Around midnight, a faint noise broke the silence. Harwood, crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers on the docks, motioned for Levi to stop. "Hear that?" he whispered. Levi nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. It was the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel, coming from the direction of the old boat shed. Harwood peered around the edge of the container, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. A figure emerged, illuminated briefly by the weak glow of a flashlight. It was Lucas. He was carrying a large, heavy bag slung over his shoulder, the shape of it too uneven to be anything innocent. Harwood's jaw tightened. "There he is," he murmured into his radio. "Teams, hold your positions. Do not engage until I give the word." Lucas moved with purpose, heading straight toward the docks where his patched-up dinghy was tied. As he approached the boat, he dropped the bag onto the deck with a dull thud. Harwood couldn't see what was inside, but he didn't need to. The man's body language screamed guilt. When Lucas bent down to start untying the boat, Harwood gave the signal. "Now," he whispered harshly into his radio. The night exploded into action. Flashlights pierced the darkness, cutting through the shadows like searchlights on a prison break. Deputies emerged from their hiding spots, their weapons drawn and their voices booming. "Lucas Grady, this is Sheriff Harwood. Put your hands where I can see them and step away from the boat," Harwood barked, his voice steady but commanding. For a moment Lucas froze like a deer caught in headlights. Then just as quickly his survival instincts kicked in. He lunged for the bag on the boat, a desperate, clumsy move that only made things worse. "Hands up now!" Harwood shouted, moving closer with his gun aimed squarely at Lucas's chest. Lucas didn't listen. Instead he pulled something shiny from the bag, something unmistakable in the moonlight. A gun. "Gun!" Levi yelled, ducking behind a wooden post as Lucas raised the weapon. Shots rang out, cracking through the still night like thunder. One of the deputies, Riley, cried out and dropped to the ground, clutching his shoulder. "Man down!" Jenkins's voice roared over the radio. Harwood's instincts took over. He dove behind a stack of barrels, firing a warning shot into the air. "Lucas, drop the weapon! You've got nowhere to go!" But Lucas was already moving. Abandoning the gunfight, he grabbed the bag and leapt into the boat, untying it with frantic hands. The motor sputtered to life, belching a black cloud of exhaust into the air. "Damn it, he's making a run for it!" Harwood growled, sprinting toward the edge of the dock. Levi was right behind him, his breathing ragged. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the water as Lucas disappeared into the thick fog that clung to the river. Harwood stood at the edge of the dock, powerless to follow as the roaring engine faded into the distance. The aftermath silence fell over the harbor once more, broken only by the groans of Riley, who was being tended to by Jenkins and Foster. The sheriff's jaw was clenched tight as he holstered his weapon, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "Son of a bitch got away," Levi muttered, his voice bitter. "For now," Harwood replied, his tone colder than the night air. He looked out over the water, his expression unreadable. "But he ain't gonna keep running. Not forever. The river may be his home, but it's also his trap, and next time, he won't slip through." As the team regrouped, recovering what little evidence they could from the scene, Harwood couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas had wanted this. The confrontation, the chaos, the escape. It was all part of his game. A game he was playing not just with the sheriff and his deputies, but with the entire town. The bag left behind on the dock told a grim story, its contents examined under the harsh light of the patrol cars. Rope, duct tape, a hunting knife, and a ledger, handwritten names scrawled across its pages, the next set of targets in Lucas Grady's twisted plot. A co-conspirator is captured. The air inside the station was heavy, filled with the unshakable tension that had hung around since the failed standoff. Sheriff Harwood sat in his office, staring blankly at the stack of evidence on his desk. The bag left behind by Lucas Grady had provided disturbing hints but nothing definitive. One thing, however, was clear. Lucas wasn't working alone. Levi Walker knocked softly on the door, edging his head through as Harwood gestured him in. "Sheriff, you're gonna want to hear this," he said, holding a notepad in one hand and his radio in the other. Harwood's tired eyes flicked up. "What now?" "We've got someone in custody. A guy out near the Delta docks. Alan Reese. You know him?" Harwood leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. Alan Reese. The name tickled something in the back of his memory. A petty smuggler, nothing major, but the kind of guy who knew how the underbelly of the river worked. Reefer, stolen goods, illegal boat parts, always careful to stay low on the police radar. If they'd caught Alan, it wasn't by accident. "Yeah, I know him," Harwood said finally. "Hardly a saint, but he's small time. What's he got to do with this?" Levi raised an eyebrow. "Well, boss, he said he knows Lucas Grady, says they've worked together." That got Harwood's full attention. He sat forward, his chair groaning under the sudden shift. "He say how?" "Not yet. He's sweating, though, real nervous. I think he knows more than he wants to admit." The interrogation. Later that evening, Harwood stepped into the dimly lit interrogation room where Alan Reese sat slouched in his chair. The man's wiry frame looked even smaller under the cold fluorescent lights. His long hair clung to his temples, damp from sweat, and his darting, bloodshot eyes betrayed the panic he was trying so desperately to keep hidden. Seated across the table, Levi Walker sat with his notebook poised, attempting to coax something useful out of the man. "You're in trouble, Alan," he was saying as Harwood entered the room. "The sooner you talk, the better it'll go for you." Reese flinched at every word, his fingers twitching like they were searching for a cigarette that wasn't there. "I already told you," he muttered, eyes avoiding both men. "I don't know nothing about no murders. I ain't no killer." Harwood walked silently to the chair across from Reese, letting the sound of his boots echo deliberately in the small space. He sat down, placing his hands flat on the table, and leaned in just slightly. "You're not a killer, Reese," Harwood began, his voice low but firm. "But you know one, don't you?" Reese froze, his shoulders tightening as if the sheriff's words had locked him in place. "Look, I don't know what you think," he started, but Harwood cut him off. "Spare me the bullshit," the sheriff snapped. We've been on Lucas Grady for weeks. Weeks, Alan. We know he's got help. Someone who knows the river, knows how to stay out of sight. And right now, all I see is you sitting here in my station, looking guilty as hell." Reese finally looked up, his lips pressed tightly together as if he was trying to physically stop the words spilling out. Harwood could tell the man was close to breaking. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. "What do you want from me?" Reese hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want the truth," Harwood replied. "You don't strike me as the guy who comes up with this kind of operation. You're not the mastermind, Alan, but you're in it, whether you like it or not. So either you tell me what you know right now, or I'll make damn sure when this comes down on Lucas, you're right there with him." Reese's gaze flickered from Harwood to Levi, then back again. His chest rose and fell in rapid breaths, and finally, with a shaky hand, he wiped the sweat from his brow. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine. I'll tell you." What Alan knew. Once the dam broke, Reese's words came out in a tumbling mess, his voice thick with fear as he clutched at the table as though it might anchor him. "I ain't no killer, Sheriff, I swear. Lucas. He's the one who does the bad stuff. Not me. I just helped him with some supplies, that's all. Just moving things up and down the river." "What kind of things?" Harwood pressed, his tone cold. Reese hesitated again, his jaw tightening. "Rope, tarps, gas cans, sometimes tools. Shit that I didn't ask too many questions about, all right? That's what he wanted. He'd pay me cash, good money to keep quiet and keep it moving." "Where?" Levi spoke up, his voice sharp. "Where were you moving these supplies, Alan? Be specific." "There's this place." Reese's fingers tapped nervously against the table. "Out past the Delta docks. You know that old boathouse, the one that's sinking into the mud? Lucas called it the drop point. That's where he liked to meet, late at night. Said it was safe because nobody goes out there. It's all swamp and fog." Harwood's eyes narrowed, logging the name. "And what happens after you drop the supplies, Alan? Did you stay?" Reese shook his head violently. "Hell no, Lucas didn't want me hanging around. Said he didn't trust people, even the ones who helped him. I just brought the stuff, got paid, and left." "What about the murders?" Harwood asked steadily, watching every twitch of Reese's face. "I don't know nothing about that," Reese's voice cracked. "I swear to God I didn't help him do it. All I know is, sometimes he'd take a boat out from the drop point real late, way later than I was ever comfortable staying. He'd always come back before dawn acting damn near giddy, like he'd done something he was proud of, you know? That man, Sheriff, that man ain't right." A lead in the darkness. Reese's confession gave Harwood and his team the most significant lead they'd had in months. The drop point, an isolated spot beyond the Delta docks where Lucas was most likely coordinating his activities. It made sense. The marshland there was nearly impenetrable without a boat, shrouded in mist even on the clearest nights. If Lucas had been using the area as a base, it would explain how he'd managed to evade capture for so long. Harwood escorted Reese back to his holding cell that night, giving the man one final piercing look through the iron bars. "You're not out of the woods yet, Alan. You gave us something to work with, but if we find out you're holding anything back, I'll make sure you never see the light of day again. Am I clear?" "Yes, Sheriff," Reese muttered, curling into himself on the edge of the cot. As Harwood walked away, Levi jogged up beside him, his notebook still in hand. "Think he's telling the truth?" Harwood sighed, his boots echoing against the tiled floor of the station hallway. "Yeah, I do. Scared little guys like Reese don't have the backbone to pull this off on their own. Lucas was using him, probably chewing him up and spitting him out like everybody else." Levi hesitated, then asked, "So what now? We hit this drop point?" "Damn right we do," Harwood replied, his voice grim, "but we do it smart. Lucas isn't gonna go quietly, and if this is where he's been hiding, it's gonna end one of two ways, with him in cuffs, or with one hell of a fight." The final chase. At the sunken pier. The night of the final chase was heavy with anticipation. The air along the river had an unnatural stillness to it, and even the usual hum of insects and the distant croak of bullfrogs seemed muted. Sheriff Tom Harwood and his team stood at the edge of the town's southern boundary, prepping themselves mentally and physically for what they all knew was going to be a dangerous night. The drop point, an old decaying boathouse that jutted from the swamp like a skeleton reaching up from the mud, was deep within one of the Mississippi's most inhospitable areas. It was the perfect place for someone like Lucas Grady to hide, and tonight, the hunt was over. Harwood tightened his utility belt, checking his sidearm one last time. Around him, his team was gearing up in tense silence. Levi Walker leaned against the patrol truck, nervously tapping his boot against the gravel. Across from him, Riley adjusted the sling on his rifle, his shoulders still stiff from the shot he'd taken during the failed standoff weeks prior. "You good, Riley?" Harwood asked, his voice low but solid as he looked over at the deputy. Riley nodded sharply. "Good enough to take this bastard down," he muttered. Levi cleared his throat, his usual youthful energy tamped down by the weight of the moment. "Sheriff, are we sure about this? I mean, if this is it, this could get real bad, real fast." Harwood turned to look at him, his gaze hard but not unkind. "Son, this has been building for months. Lucas has had every chance to run, to disappear downriver like everybody said he would. But he didn't. He's still here because he's got unfinished business. And tonight, we're gonna finish it first. You understand?" Levi swallowed and nodded. "Yes, sir." The approach. The team moved under the cover of darkness, their boats gliding silently through the narrow channels that twisted toward the drop point. Harwood manned the lead boat, the engine cut as they drifted along, using nothing but the paddles to keep noise to a minimum. The marshland on either side of the river loomed like a wall, dense with trees and vines that tangled together in a way that blocked out even the moonlight. The fog was thick, creating an eerie, otherworldly glow as flashlights occasionally sliced through the mist. "This place gives me the creeps," Levi muttered, his voice barely above a whisper as he sat at the bow of the boat scanning the water ahead. "It's supposed to," Harwood replied without looking back. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faintest glimmer of light flickered, a lantern, swaying gently near the structure that must have been the drop point. "He wants this place to keep people out, makes it perfect for him." As they drew closer, the boathouse came into view. It was a rotting, sagging relic of a building that barely clung to the edge of the marsh, its sunken pilings looking ready to collapse at any moment. The lantern hung from a rusted nail near the entrance, casting long shadows across the water's surface. One of the team radios crackled softly to life. "Sheriff, this is Jenkins. We're in position on the west end. No movement yet." "Copy that," Harwood replied, his voice calm and steady. "Stay low and keep your eyes sharp. He's here. I can feel it." The boats circled around, fanning out to cover all possible escape routes. Harwood's team of 6 officers took their positions in silence, their boots making muffled sounds against the rotting wooden beams of the dock as they disembarked. Harwood motioned for Levi to stay close, and the two crept forward toward the main entrance of the boathouse. The confrontation. The inside of the boathouse was worse than Harwood had imagined. The smell hit him first, a sickly mix of rotting wood, stagnant water, and something darker, heavier. The interior was littered with debris, old fishing nets, broken crates, rusted tools. But it wasn't the trash that caught Harwood's attention. It was the carefully arranged setup near the back of the room. A table sat in the center, covered in maps of the river, ropes, knives, and a ledger that sent chills down his spine. "It's all here," Levi whispered, his voice catching as he pointed toward the ledger. "Look at it, Sheriff. Names, dates. He's been planning this for months, maybe years." Harwood stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything. There were at least a dozen names scrawled across the pages, some marked with crude X's that made his gut tighten. Annabelle Green, Matthew Carter, Mary Collins. And underlined near the bottom of the list was another name, Levi Walker. Levi paled. "Sheriff, that's my name. He had me on this list." Before Harwood could respond, a low sound broke the silence. A footstep on the dock outside. Harwood froze, his hand instinctively moving to his firearm. Levi's eyes darted toward the door, his breath quickening. "Stay calm," Harwood whispered, motioning for Levi to take cover. He pressed himself against the wall, his gun drawn as the footsteps grew louder. The door creaked open slowly, and Lucas Grady stepped inside. His wiry frame was illuminated by the faint light of the lantern behind him, casting him in shadow. He carried a hunting knife in one hand and a shotgun slung across his back, his eyes scanning the room methodically. "Lucas Grady, put your hands where I can see them," Harwood commanded, his voice steady but firm as he stepped out from the shadows. Lucas's lip curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Sheriff, you finally came to visit. Thought you'd never get here." "Drop the knife, Lucas. Don't make this harder than it already is." Lucas cocked his head, his expression wild and unreadable. "Hard? You think this is hard? You ain't seen nothing. The river's got its secrets, Sheriff. You think you're here to end this? But you're just another piece of the story." Before Harwood could respond, Lucas lunged, moving faster than anyone anticipated. The knife glinted in the lantern light as he dove toward Levi, who scrambled backward, his gun slipping from his hands as Lucas slammed into him. "Levi!" Harwood shouted, surging forward. He tackled Lucas, the two men going down hard onto the floorboards. The knife clattered away, disappearing into the shadows, but Lucas wasn't done. He twisted, his wiry strength surprising as he broke free and reached for the shotgun on his back. "Drop it!" Riley's voice rang out as he burst through the rear entrance, his rifle trained on Lucas. For a split second, Lucas hesitated, then with a growl of frustration he released the weapon and raised his hands. Harwood didn't waste time, slamming him face first onto the ground and cuffing him as Lucas laughed, a low, chilling sound that echoed through the boathouse. "You think this ends here?" Lucas muttered as Harwood hauled him to his feet. "You don't even know what you're dealing with." Harwood ignored him, his jaw clenched as he marched Lucas outside. The rest of the team regrouped, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they secured the area. Levi stood near the dock, catching his breath, his hands still shaking as he stared at the ledger. The aftermath. By the time dawn broke, the drop point was crawling with officers and forensic teams. Lucas Grady sat silently in the back of a patrol car, his head bowed but a grim smile still etched on his face. Harwood stood on the dock, staring out at the misty river as the first light of morning turned the water gold. "This isn't over," Levi said quietly, stepping up beside him. His voice was steadier now, but there was still a trace of fear in his eyes. "I know," Harwood replied, his gaze never leaving the water, "but it's a start." Exposing the crimes. The morning after Lucas Grady's capture was a blur of activity at the sheriff's office. The once quiet station now hummed with the rhythm of telephones ringing, boots clunking against the tile floors, and the murmur of voices as deputies pieced together everything they had uncovered. Files were spread across desks, stacked in uneven piles, and the smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air. Lucas sat in a holding cell at the back of the station, silent and brooding, though every now and then, a faint smirk crept across his face, as if even being caged was still part of his game. Sheriff Tom Harwood stood in the middle of the conference room, one hand gripping a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, the other pointing to the aging corkboard slapped with notes, photos, maps, and evidence bags. His team stood gathered around him, the wear of the last several months clear on their faces, yet there was a certain sharpness in their eyes now, a purpose. "All right, let's lay it all out," Harwood began, his voice firm, carrying above the chatter. "We've got Lucas Grady in custody, but this thing is far from over." He gestured to the photos on the board. The victims, the cryptic symbols carved into the boats, the eerie threats left on pieces of paper at crime scenes. Now's the time to make sense of the hell he's put this town through. Levi Walker, seated at the corner of the table with his notebook open, cleared his throat. "Sheriff, the ledger we recovered from the drop point, it's got details, dates, names, even amounts of money. Looks like Lucas was keeping records of every transaction." "Transactions?" Riley cut in, leaning forward. His arm was still bandaged from the earlier standoff, but he was fully engaged. "What are we talking about here? Blackmail? Extortion?" Levi nodded. "Probably both. From what I can tell, this goes back years. Lucas wasn't just a killer. He was running some kind of underground loan operation. Illegal loans. High interest, no paperwork. And if people couldn't pay him back..." He trailed off, swallowing hard. "They paid with their lives," Harwood finished grimly. He ran a hand over his face, the weight of it all sinking deeper on his shoulders. Lucas used the river as his weapon and his playground. He'd pick his targets carefully, people who were already desperate, already drowning in problems, and he'd lure them in with promises of quick cash. But when they couldn't meet his terms, Harwood gestured to the photos of the victims. "You know the rest." Riley slammed his hand against the table, his frustration boiling over. "And we didn't see this for years? Folks just disappear or turn up dead and all we could do was spin stories about accidents and bad luck?" Harwood's jaw tightened. "We didn't have the full picture, Riley, not until now." He shifted his attention back to the ledger. "That book ties everything together, his victims, his methods, even his network of accomplices. Piecing together, the network." Levi flipped through his notebook, glancing at the notes he'd made overnight. "Speaking of accomplices," he said, "Alan Reese's confession filled in some of the blanks. Reese wasn't just a lackey moving supplies up and down the river, he handled logistics. He knew where the targets lived, where they worked, their routines. Lucas relied on people like Reese to make his killings look like accidents or disappearances." Harwood nodded, pacing the room. "And what about the others? He had to have more than just Reese." "Well," Levi continued, "Reese mentioned a name, Carl Denton. Said Denton was a contact in one of the neighboring towns, a guy who'd help Lucas find late payers. Do background checks, that sort of thing. Looks like Lucas's operation stretched farther than we thought." I'll make sure Denton's on the next damn warrant we issue, Harwood grumbled, rubbing the back of his neck. But let's focus on Lucas for now. What about the symbols? He pointed to a photo pinned to the board, a close-up of the crescent moon carving found on Jason Riggs's boat. Every victim turned up with one of these nearby. It wasn't random. Levi straightened. The crescent moon? That might have been Lucas's way of marking his territory. I did some digging and the symbol isn't tied to any known gangs or cults, but it shows up in his notes. It's like a signature. He wanted everyone, including us, to know it was him. To send a message, Riley said, his voice low, like he wanted to be feared. Exactly, said Levi. He wasn't just killing, he was terrorizing the entire town. Breaking Lucas's silence. The conversation turned as Harwood glanced toward the holding cells at the back of the station. We've got plenty of evidence, he said, his tone steel. But I want to hear it from his own mouth. We've got enough to tie him to the killings, but I'm not walking into court with just circumstantial evidence. Levi, you're with me. Let's see if we can get him to talk. They moved to the holding area, passing rows of cells until they reached Lucas's. He was seated on the cot, his hands resting on his knees, staring at the floor as if the concrete held his secrets. When he heard the footsteps, he looked up, that damned smirk playing at the edges of his mouth. Sheriff, Lucas drawled, leaning back against the wall. Come to gloat, or maybe you're here because you're missing something. Cut the crap, Lucas, Harwood said, folding his arms as he took a step closer. We've got your ledger. We've got your accomplices. It's all coming apart. You've got one chance to tell us everything, who else you were working with, why you did this, or you'll ride the rest of your days straight to a needle. Lucas chuckled softly, shaking his head. You think it's that simple, don't you, Sheriff? He leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. You can lock me up, but you'll never stop the river. This isn't just about me, it's bigger than you, bigger than this town. Harwood's jaw clenched. What does that mean? Bigger how? There's always another deal, Lucas said cryptically. Another desperate fool who needs a handout, another man too proud to pay what he owes. You think I'm the only one? What I did, Sheriff. It's a tradition. The river takes what it wants, always has, always will. Levi stepped forward, his anger barely contained. You're nothing but a thug with a knife in a boat. Drop the act. But Lucas just laughed, the sound dark and hollow. You keep telling yourself that, kid. The truth comes to light. By the time the interrogation ended, Harwood had all he needed, names, places, details that filled in every gap the investigation had missed. Lucas Grady's operation was more insidious than anyone had imagined. He preyed on the weak, the desperate, the overlooked. And when he was done with them, he left their bodies as warnings, not just to scare off others, but to remind the town of the power he thought he controlled. Back in the conference room, Harwood spread the final pieces of evidence across the table, looking around at his team. This was never just about murder, he said, his voice heavy. This was about control. Lucas used fear like a damn weapon, and for too long this town let him get away with it. But it ends here. Levi sat silently, staring at the ledger. Sheriff, he said after a moment, do you think the town will ever recover from this? Harwood sighed, the weight of the question settling deep into him. Maybe, but it's gonna take time. People need to believe they're safe again. And right now, that's on us to make happen. As the team prepared the mountain of evidence for prosecutors, the morning sun spilled through the station windows. For the first time in months, there was a sense of closure, but the shadow of Lucas's crimes would linger long after the case was closed. The final verdict and warning. The courthouse was packed. On the day of the trial, every bench in the gallery was filled, every corner of the room occupied by a face etched with either anger, grief, or morbid curiosity. The town's grief-stricken residents, some of whom had lost family to Lucas Grady's twisted game, watched silently as the legal process unfolded. The reporters, ever eager for a headline that sold, scribbled furiously in their notebooks or snapped photos whenever the opportunity arose. The room radiated with the tension of months of fear, heartbreak, and rage that had been bottled up since the first whispers of the Mississippi Wraith began to spread through the community. Sheriff Tom Harwood sat in the back row, his arms crossed as his sharp gaze bore into the back of Lucas Grady's head. Watching Lucas, shackled in his orange jumpsuit and seated across from his defense attorney, Harwood felt no triumph, no relief, just the steady, pounding pressure that came with trying to rebuild something after it had been utterly destroyed. He knew all too well that justice handed down inside a courtroom wasn't the kind of justice that reached people's hearts. They needed more than a verdict, they needed closure. The courtroom drama. The trial had lasted weeks, with prosecutors untangling Lucas's intricate web of lies, extortion, and murder. Every day brought a fresh wave of horror as new evidence was presented. Grisly photos of the victims, items recovered from the drop point, and excerpts from the blood-stained ledger that documented years of Lucas's crimes. The jury sat stone-faced as they heard testimony from Alan Reese, Lucas's coerced accomplice, whose trembling voice left no room for doubt about the killer's ruthlessness. Reese's confession was the turning point. His account of Lucas's operations laid bare the true scope of the criminal empire Lucas had built on fear and desperation. "He didn't just kill people," Reese had said during his testimony, clasping his shaking hands together on the stand. He owned them. He'd make them borrow money knowing they couldn't pay up, then he'd take them out to the river." Every word Reese spoke silenced the courtroom further. The gallery watched with morbid fascination, some leaning forward in their seats, others covering their mouths with tissues or fists clenched in anger. Reese's voice cracked when he described the times he'd heard Lucas talk about the river as if it were alive, as if it demanded payment. "The river's got its own rules," Reese said, quoting Lucas. "That's what he used to say. It doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive." I didn't understand what he meant until I saw what he did to Mary Collins. His hands trembled on the witness stand as he muttered the haunting words. He loved it. He loved watching us all suffer. Lucas, seated at the defendant's table, showed no remorse. He never flinched. When Reese glanced toward him, his body shrinking into itself with fear, Lucas let the faintest smile cross his lips, his stare cold and unnerving. That was the moment Harwood knew. Lucas had let the trial play out not because he thought he might win, but because he wanted to savor it. The verdict. By the time the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse felt like it was holding its breath. Levi Walker sat beside Harwood, fidgeting with a pen in his hand. "You think they'll convict him?" Levi whispered, his voice barely carrying over the muted hum of the room. Harwood didn't look away from the front of the room as he answered lowly, "I think they have to. No way they don't." Still, the waiting gnawed at everyone. Harwood recalled other trials he'd witnessed over the years. Trials where justice barely whispered through the cracks or where technicalities let the guilty walk free. The thought of Lucas slipping through their fingers kept Harwood's muscles tense and his mind racing. He'd seen Lucas's meticulous planning firsthand, how the man always seemed a step ahead. Even now, shackled and facing a mountain of evidence, there was the nagging sense that Lucas might still find a way out. But just 2 hours later, when the jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces somber and resolute, everyone knew the outcome before the verdict was announced. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." The foreman's voice rang out like a hammer falling. "Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of conspiracy to commit extortion, guilty of organized criminal activity." The gallery erupted into a mixture of muted cheers and sobs, the weight of the moment washing over everyone. Families clutched each other in relief, while others quietly folded their hands in silent prayers for the dead. Harwood exhaled, his shoulders easing as he leaned back against the wooden bench. Levi glanced at him, a faint smile of satisfaction tugging at his lips, but Harwood just stared blankly ahead. The judge's next words sealed Lucas Grady's fate. "The court hereby sentences the defendant, Lucas Grady, to death by lethal injection." For the first time throughout the trial, Lucas's expression faltered. His smirk dipped, if only slightly, and his eyes scanned the room as if searching for the exit. Harwood caught the faintest twitch of Lucas's lip. Was it fear? Maybe, but it was fleeting. Lucas leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow, measured breath, as if he'd accepted his fate long ago. The warning. It wasn't over, though, not for Harwood and not for the people of the town. As Harwood exited the courthouse later that day, weaving through reporters who crowded the steps, he stopped when Levi tugged at his sleeve. "Sheriff, you hear what Lucas said before they took him back to holding?" Harwood cocked an eyebrow. "What'd he say?" Levi hesitated, lowering his voice. "He told me, 'It doesn't end out here, kid. It keeps going. The river never stops.' He said it like he wanted me to know this wasn't over. Like he's got something else out there." Harwood frowned, his boots scuffing against the concrete steps as they moved toward their truck. "Well, of course he said that, manipulative bastard. Men like him don't let go easy, even when they're neck-deep in consequences. Don't let him get in your head, Levi." Still, the words lingered. Harwood couldn't shake the thought as he drove home that evening, the Mississippi River gleaming in the distance under the setting sun. Lucas's referral to the river wasn't just his way of deflecting blame, It was a chilling reminder of the power that water held over the life of the town. The river had always been there, sprawling and indifferent, swallowing death while giving life in return, and somewhere beneath its calm surface, Harwood wondered how many secrets remained buried, waiting, an uneasy peace. In the weeks following the trial, the town began its slow process of healing. The docks, once ghostly and abandoned after dark, began showing signs of life again. Fishermen returned to the water cautiously, their wary eyes scanning the riverbanks as they tried to let go of the fear that had gripped them for so long. The Strickland brothers reopened shop and families cautiously ventured back to the markets, but no one forgot. The scars Lucas left on the town couldn't be erased with a verdict, no matter how satisfying it had been to see justice served. On the night of Lucas's execution months later, Harwood sat alone in his office, the curtains drawn and the quiet of the station pressing in like a weight. The news came through, a sterile announcement over the wire. Lucas Grady was pronounced dead at 11:43 p.m. There was no joy in it, no catharsis. Harwood leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the corkboard where photos of the victims remained pinned, a quiet memorial to names he vowed never to forget. He thought again of Lucas's warning, the subtle threat stitched into his final words. The river never stops. And neither do we, Harwood muttered to himself, his voice firm but weary. He finished his coffee, grabbed his coat and drove down to the riverfront where the water gleamed faintly under the cold night sky. He stood there for a long time staring at the surface, knowing Lucas was dead, but knowing the river, and the town, still had a lot more stories to tell.